Merritt woke on a beach with a dead man's hand resting on her arm and lay very still, because she could not yet remember whether the dead man had been alive when the ship went down. The hand did not move. She made herself turn her head one slow inch at a time, sand grinding under her cheek. It was Joss, the deckhand, 19 maybe, freckled, the one who had laughed at her seasickness 2 days out and then held the bucket for her anyway. The sea had brought them ashore together, tangled, the way the sea does what it likes with people, and Joss's eyes were open and full of sand and there was nothing behind them at all. Not dead the way this world meant dead. Just gone, drowned and done. She said the smallest prayer she knew over him anyway, moving her lips without sound, because the habit of it was the only thing in her that still worked. Then she heard, from somewhere down the beach, the sound of something that had drowned 200 years ago getting to its feet. She did not look first. Looking first was a thing she would learn later, on the road, and pay for the learning. She simply froze, the whole animal of her body making the decision before her mind was awake enough to argue, and lay in the tangle of wreck and weed with Joss's cold hand on her arm and listened. Footsteps in wet sand, slow, uneven, a sound like breath that wasn't breath, a dry working of air through a throat that had no more use for it. Merritt had heard about them her whole life. Everyone had. The world had drowned 200 years ago and the dead had not stayed down and the coasts and the interior belonged to them, and the living clung to their harbors and their walls and their water and did not go where she was now lying. She had heard about them her whole life and she had never been within a mile of one because she was nobody, a candle maker from a walled harbor town, a woman who had spent 40 years being careful. The footsteps came up the beach. They stopped. Close, she could smell it now, old salt and older rot, the smell of the sea's basement. It was standing over the wreckage, over Joss, over her. Merritt lay with her eyes almost shut, her chest barely rising, her heart going so hard she was certain the thing could hear it, and did the only thing she knew how to do, which was pray. Not aloud, not even with her lips now. Just the words in the dark of her skull, over and over, the pilgrim's line she had paid a ship's passage to go and say at the sanctum of Ardenveil, I am walking to the light. Wait for me. I am walking to the light. The dead thing stood over her for a long time. Then it moved on down the beach, dragging one foot, in no hurry at all, because it had nowhere to be and forever to get there. That was the first hour of the 6 days. When the beach had been quiet a long while, she made herself move. The gull of morning had died in the night on a reef she never saw, and the sea had taken it apart with its usual thoroughness. What was left lay strewn along a quarter-mile of gray sand, planks, rope, a shattered water cask, cloth, bodies. 11 souls had sailed from Nairi, pilgrims and crew, bound around the coast for the holy city, and Merritt walked the tide line in the gray light and found 6 of them and none of them breathing. And by the time she had finished looking, she understood that the sea had made a decision in the night, and the decision was her. Why her? She stood over the captain, a decent man face down in the shallows, and asked it plainly, because there was nobody left to think her mad. Why me? I'm nobody. Joss was 19. The captain had 4 children. The other pilgrims were holier than me, they knew the songs they'd saved for years, one of them had walked barefoot since Thessara. I'm a candle maker who talks to her dead husband when she works. Why me? The sea didn't answer, it never does, that's what the land was for. She took stock because grief was a luxury, and she had a coastal woman's instinct for rationing. A water skin half full off poor Joss's belt. A knife, a working knife, small, the kind you cut rope with, not the kind you fight with. Half a loaf of ship's bread in an oilskin that had kept the sea out. Her boots, which had stayed on, which mattered more than everything else together. And around her neck, on a cord, the little tin sun of the first light that her husband had worn for 30 years, and she had worn for 2, the rising sun breaking through storm clouds, worn smooth with his thumbing, the whole reason she was on this coast at all. Toma had died 2 winters ago with a promise on him. He'd meant to walk to Ardenveil his whole life. Every year next year, when the shop was steadier, when the war of the day was done next year, and then there were no more next years, and Merritt had sat by his bed at the end and made the promise for him. I'll go, I'll carry the sun to the sanctum and say your name in the light. 2 years it had taken her to save the passage. 11 souls had sailed. All right, Toma, she said aloud on the empty beach to the empty world. The ship's gone, I'm still coming. The geography was simple and terrible. She knew it the way everyone knew it, from maps chalked on harbor walls. Ardenveil sat at the mouth of its river, days up the coast. By sea, a day's sail. There was no more sea for her, nothing to float, no harbor within reach behind her, and the coast between here and the city was drowned lowland, tidal marsh and slumped cliffs where the dead of 100 old villages stood in the surf. The pilgrim stories all agreed on one thing: nobody walked to Ardenveil. The land route wasn't a route, it was the reason the ships existed. She could stay on the beach and die politely, waiting for a sail that had no reason to pass. Or she could walk. Merritt ate a corner of the bread, tied the water skin to her belt, put the tin sun inside her shirt where it lay cold against her heart, and walked. The first thing the land taught her was that the dead were not the horror. The horror was the arithmetic. One of the dead was slow. She learned that the first day when she came over a dune and there was one standing in the grass not 30 feet off, a fisherman by the rags of him, 200 years of weather on him, and her whole body went to ice and it turned toward her and she ran, and when she finally stopped running she understood it had never had any hope of catching her. Legs that old don't run. One of the dead in the open in daylight was a problem the living could always solve. But one of the dead saw you, and where there was one there were more, and the dead did not need to catch you today. They did not sleep, they did not eat, they did not stop, and you did all three. The arithmetic of the road was that the dead only had to win once, and you had to win every single hour of 6 days, and the moment enough of them knew where you were, the hours started running out. So she learned the rules the way you learn anything, badly, nearly fatally, one at a time. Never the skyline. She learned that when she walked a ridgetop to keep her bearings and looked back at dusk and saw, scattered across the mile behind her, a dozen distant figures all faced the same way, faced her way, not following her trail, following the sight of her, printed against the sky. She came down off the ridge and walked the low seams of the land after that, out of sight, checking her direction on the sun, and it cost her half her speed and it was worth double. Never twilight. The dead did not see well, she worked that out watching them from cover, the way their heads tracked sound and movement more than shape. But at dusk and dawn, when the light went flat and gray, her own eyes failed before theirs did. Twilight was for hiding, not walking. She walked the bright middle of the day and the dead of the dark, when at least the darkness was honest for everyone, and she went to ground twice a day like an animal, and told no one because there was no one. Never complain. That one she made for herself, second night, lying in a hollow under a fallen roof with her feet bleeding and her stomach a small hard fist. She caught herself starting to cry and stopped, not because crying was weak but because crying was loud, and she said instead into the dark, the way she'd said it over 40 years of candle wax and small troubles. Well, Toma, you always said the walk would be the easy part. And she laughed instead once, almost silently, and the laugh did more for her than the crying would have. That became a rule too, talk to Toma. Quietly, it kept the fear from getting a clean grip. The ford nearly ended it on the second day. A river cut her path, a real one, brown and fast with the autumn rains, and the only crossing in either direction was the drowned bones of an old village at its mouth, where the water spread wide and shallow over what had been streets. She stood in cover a long time, looking at it, and the shallow water was full of the dead. Standing, a congregation of them, scattered across the flooded street, thigh-deep, motionless, the way they went when there was nothing to hunt, and the crossing wound right through them, no way around, marsh upstream for miles and the sea downstream. Merritt thought about Ardenveil's pilgrims coming up the river in their safe boats, and she thought about the bread in her pocket, 2 days of it left, and she thought, the arithmetic doesn't care how afraid I am. And she waited for the wind to pick up. Wind in the reeds made a moving, whispering world, and in a moving world her movement was one thread among thousands, and when it blew, she walked into the water among the dead. Slow, even, the water pushing at her knees, then her thighs. She passed the first of them close enough to count the barnacles grown into its shoulders. Its head turned not at her at the sound of the water she'd moved, and she froze midstream with the current combing past her and the dead thing's ruined face searching the wind a yard away, and she stood there for 100 heartbeats, being nothing, being water, while the tin sun lay like ice against her chest and the words went round the dark of her skull. I am walking to the light. Wait for me. The head turned away. She reached the far bank in another 100 years of slow steps and climbed out, and did not permit herself to shake until she was over the rise and down the far side. And then she shook so hard she had to sit down, and while she shook she found she was grinning like a madwoman, and she said, Toma, you would have hated that, and got up and walked on. On the third day she found the pilgrim who hadn't made it, and that was where the road stopped testing her feet and started testing the rest of her. He lay in the lee of a standing stone that some hand had carved long ago with the rising sun of the first light, an old waymark which meant this desperate coast had been a pilgrim road once after all before the world drowned, when walking to the holy city was a thing the devout did on their own 2 feet. The man had been dead a season, not 2 centuries. His pack was still on his back. His boots were better than hers. And pressed under his folded hands, wrapped in oilcloth against the weather, was a book of the remembrance, its cover worn soft as cloth with reading. He had been doing what she was doing, walking to the light. He had prayed the same words at the same kind of waymark and believed the same believing, and the road had killed him anyway quietly out of anyone's sight, and no god had troubled the arithmetic on his behalf. Merritt sat down by the dead pilgrim because her legs decided to, and had it out with the sky. "Why me and not him?" she said quietly. Even her arguments with God were quiet now, the road had trained her. "He believed more than I do. Look at his book, it's read to rags. I can't even read Toma read to me. He walked this road on purpose for faith, and I'm only walking it because the sea threw me at it. If one of us was going to be seen and kept, it was him. So either nobody's watching, or the watching doesn't work the way the priests say, and I don't know which of those frightens me more." The sky said nothing. It never does. That's what the walking was for. She took his boots. She sat with that a long moment first, and then she said the burial words over him, all of them properly, the way the priests did it. And then she took his boots and his pack and the last of his oat cakes, because her boots had opened at the seam and her bread was gone, and she had learned by now that the road did not let you carry anything as heavy as squeamishness. "You'd want a pilgrim to finish the walk," she told him. "Even if it's the wrong pilgrim, I'll say your name in the light too. I don't know it, so I'll just say the one who read. The light will know who I mean. The light saw you reading." She did not take the remembrance. She wrapped it back in its oilcloth and set it under the waymark stone, in the carved sun's shadow, where the weather would take a long time to find it. Some things belonged to the man who'd carried them. It was the fourth day when she realized the dead had begun to follow her. Not chase, follow. She crested a rise at noon and looked back along the low seam of country she'd been walking, careful, the way she checked every hour, and the land behind her was moving. Scattered, distant, slow. Figures in the grass, figures on the tide flats, ones and twos and then not ones and twos, all drifting the way she was going, like iron filings remembering a magnet. She had made mistakes. That was the honest ledger of it. The skyline on the first day. A slip and a clatter on the scree above the ford. A night she'd misjudged, walking an hour past safe light. None of them had killed her. All of them had been seen or heard, and the dead did not forget and did not stop, and every mistake she had made for 4 days was still out there, walking after her, patient as weather, and the mistakes were adding up faster than she could outwalk them. And ahead of her, where the coast bent toward the river mouth and the holy city, the land funneled, the hills shouldering down to the sea, the marsh crowding in, and everything that walked this coast would be funneled with it, into the same last miles she had to cross. The arithmetic was closing. She could feel it closing. She had perhaps a day and a half of walking left, and the road had spent 4 days learning where she was. The 5th day was the worst, and she spent the night of it standing upright in the dark, and by morning the plan and the food and the water and very nearly the faith had all run out together. The funnel was worse than she'd feared. The old coast road, the true pilgrim road, its paving stones still showing through the turf in stretches, its waymarks still standing every mile with their carved suns, ran the only walkable line between the hills and the drowned marsh, and everything dead on that coast walked it too, because the dead took the easy ground the same as the living. She spent the day off the road's edge, in the rocks and the gorse, paralleling it, watching the traffic of the dead drift along the pilgrim's way in 1s and 3s, and every hour there were more, and every hour her margin thinned. At dusk she went to ground in a stone barn, roofless, its doorway narrow enough to watch, and the night came down, and with the night the dead came up the road in numbers she had not seen in 5 days, and some of them left the road. She heard the first one enter the yard, while there was still a smear of gray in the sky. Footsteps on the old cobbles. That dragging gait she knew now the way she knew her own heartbeat, step, drag, step, crossing the yard, unhurried, wandering. Then a second set off to the left by what had been the well. Then more further out, a slow scatter of them drifting in off the road like leaves finding a corner, and Merritt stood in the blackest angle of the barn, where the fallen roof beams made a pocket of deeper dark, and understood that the night was going to be long in a way no night of her life had been long. She had chosen the corner with care while there was light, stone at her back, beams above her breaking up her shape. The doorway a paler rectangle she could watch without moving her head. She had swept the floor of her corner with her boots, slowly clearing the grit and the twig litter so that a shifted foot would make no sound, and she had eaten the last oat cake and drunk half the last water, because a body that is starving is a body that shakes, and tonight she could not afford to shake. Then she stood, and the dead walked her yard, and the hours began. The first hours were traffic. Step, drag, step. The dry breath, that awful working of air through throats that had no use for it, not breathing, just the body's old habit rattling on, passing the doorway, pausing, moving off. She counted them by sound, 4 in the yard, then 6. One stood at the well for the better part of an hour, utterly still, and she began to think of it as the sentry, and hated it with a pure exhausted hatred, because its stillness meant she could not track it, and a thing she could not track was a thing that could be anywhere. The words kept her company, walking to the light. Wait for me. Not spoken, not even whispered now, just moving through the dark of her skull in rhythm with her pulse, wearing a groove there, and she leaned on the rhythm the way she'd leaned on Toma's arm on ice, and the hours passed, and her legs burned, and she did not sit, because a woman sitting is a woman who sleeps, and a woman who sleeps makes the small sounds sleepers make. The hand came in the middle of the night. She heard it begin at the far end of the wall she stood against, a soft, dry dragging, fingertips on stone, trailing along the outside of the barn at the height of a standing man's reach. Slow, slower than walking, a blind man reading a wall. It came along the stone toward her corner, inch by inch, and Merritt stood with her back against the inside of that same wall and felt the sound pass behind her shoulder blades, through the stone, a hand's breadth of rock between her spine and whatever 200-year-old fingers were reading their way along the other side. It stopped. Directly behind her. The dragging stopped, and the dry breath was there instead, close on the other side of the wall, and it did not move on. It knows, her fear said. It can hear your heart through the stone. And her craft answered very quietly the way 5 days had taught it to answer. It knows nothing. It found a wall. The dead find walls all night, do not move. And she did not move, and 3 feet of night and 1 foot of stone away the dead thing stood with its hand flat on the barn. And the two of them waited each other out, the drowned and the living, for what the stars said later was most of an hour, until at last the fingers dragged on, and away, and down the far corner and gone. It was after that, her legs shaking now, her mind fraying at its edges, that the near thing happened, and it happened because of a stone the size of an egg. One of them came into the barns. She heard it at the doorway first, the pale rectangle darkened, a shape in it, head wrong, shoulders wrong, and then the step drag came over the threshold and into the roofless dark with her, and Merritt's whole body went to iron. It was inside, 10 paces. It had not seen her. It moved the way the aimless ones moved, wandering, bumping the old stalls, drifting deeper into the barn on no errand at all. But the barn was small, and her corner was a corner, and the drift of it was bringing it toward her pocket of dark, one meandering step at a time, and there was nowhere behind her to go. 8 paces, she could smell it now, the sea's basement, 6. Her hand, flat against the swept floor behind her where she had braced without knowing it, closed on the stone. Egg-sized, smooth. She had swept her corner clean, and this one stone had been under her hand the whole night like a thing left there. 4 paces. The ruined face swung toward her corner, blind and seeking, the dry breath quickening the way it did when they were close to something, and every instinct she had screamed knife, and the knife was madness. The knife was a shout in a house full of sleepers. She threw the stone. Not at it, past it. A soft underhand toss across the barn, the way you'd lob an egg to a child, and the stone went out through the far window gap and landed in the yard beyond, one small clean knock of rock on cobble, off to the north, away. The dead thing turned. The whole night turned. She heard the sentry at the well come off its stillness, heard the yard's slow traffic wheel toward the sound like water finding a new low place, and the thing in the barn went step drag past her corner, so close its trailing hand stirred the air by her cheek, out through the doorway, drawn to the little knock in the dark the way she had watched the dead be drawn for 5 days. It had cost her 1 stone and the last dry corner of her nerve. She stood in the black with her hand over her own mouth and shook, silently from her knees to her scalp, and did not make a sound, and the words in her skull had stopped being a prayer and become a bare handhold. Light, wait, light, wait. Somewhere in the smallest hour after that, with the yard still restless and her legs past feeling, she heard her own mind say, quite clearly and reasonably, no one is waiting. No one waited for the man with the book. There is no light, there is only the city, and you will not reach the city because the road is full and you are one tired woman with a rope knife and 1 less stone. And she gripped the tin sun until its edge cut her palm, and answered the voice with the only argument she had left, which was Toma's thumb-worn metal and the blood it was drawing, and she held on. Dawn came gray and small, the yard was empty, the road was not. She looked out of the barn doorway at the last of her journey, and the truth of it was very simple. The city was there. She could see it, that was the mercy and the cruelty of the 5th morning, Ardenveil itself, far off down the coast where the river met the sea. Pale walls, the shine of the sanctum catching the first sun, close enough that on a clear road it was half a day's walk. The holy city, the destination of the drowned world's every pilgrim, sitting in the morning light like the promise of every sermon her husband had ever loved. And between her and it the funnel had filled. The The coast road and the flats around it were scattered thick with the dead, hundreds drifting, milling, thickest exactly where the land narrowed at the river's mouth. The accumulated toll of 200 years of drowned villages, plus every one of her own mistakes, arrived ahead of her and waiting. There was no cover ahead. The hills fell away, the marsh pressed in, and the last miles to Ardenveil ran across open ground through the middle of all of it. No food, a mouthful of water, a rope knife, a woman alone. There was no clever way across. She looked for one for a long time, the whole morning, working the ground with her eyes the way 5 days had taught her, wind and light and dead ground and lines of sight, and the answer kept coming back the same. Everything she had learned, every rule the road had beaten into her, said the same thing: you do not cross that. You wait here and you starve in sight of the city. So Merritt stopped asking what a survivor would do, and asked what a pilgrim would do, and that was the moment the whole walk had been walking toward. She sat in the barn doorway with the tin sun in her cut hand and talked it through with Toma, one last time, quietly, watching the far shine of the sanctum. Here's what I know, she said. 5 days I've hidden, it was right to hide. Hiding got me here. But hiding's finished, there's no hiding on that ground, and waiting is just dying with extra steps. So the arithmetic's done, Toma. The arithmetic says I end here, 1 mile short or 40, it doesn't matter, ended is ended. She turned the little sun over in her fingers. The rising sun breaking through storm clouds, worn smooth by a thumb she'd loved. But here's the other thing I know. I didn't come as arithmetic, I came as a promise. And you always said, the walk to the light isn't a walk you make when it's safe, or nobody would ever have needed the word faith at all. She laughed, small and almost silent, one more time. I used to think that was just a thing you said to get out of fixing the roof. She stood up, her legs held. She drank the last mouthful of water and put the knife away in her belt, because the knife had no argument to make against hundreds, and she was done pretending this was a problem the knife could solve, and she took the tin sun in her fist and stepped out of the barn onto the open ground in the full plain light of morning and walked down toward the road, and the dead and the city straight, unhidden, at a pilgrim's pace. Not because she was certain anyone was watching. Because she had promised to walk to the light, and the last mile of a promise is still the promise. And if the road was going to take her, it could take her walking upright toward the sanctum with her husband's son in her hand, and not starved in a barn with her back to a wall. That much was hers to choose. It was the only thing left that was hers to choose, and she chose it with everything she had. The first of the dead turned toward her before she reached the road. She did not stop. She did not run. Running was a fleeing animal. Running was the thing they followed. She walked, even and slow, the pace of a woman in a procession, straight down the old pilgrim road between its waymarked stones, and the dead came drifting in from the flats on either side, and her heart was a hammer and her mouth was moving, and she walked. I am walking to the light, wait for me. They closed toward her, and the awful thing, the thing she could never afterward describe to the priests who asked, was how slow it all was. No rush, no wave, just the patient dead angling in from every side at the pace of the tide coming in, nearer with every step she took. A closing hand of hundreds with her at the middle of it, and 40 years of being careful screamed at her to break and run and be pulled down in 100 yards, and she did not run. She walked. It was the bravest thing done in the drowned world that morning, and there was no one at all to see it. Or that was the arithmetic. What happened next, Merritt told truly for the rest of her life, and never once was believed entirely, and never once minded. A bell rang. Far off and small at first, from the pale city at the water's edge, the great dawn bell of the sanctum of Ardenveil, ringing the morning office the way it had rung it every morning for 150 years, a sound that had nothing to do with her, a sound as ordinary to that city as gulls. It came down the coast on the morning wind and rolled across the flats, bronze and enormous and alive, the first made sound louder than a footstep that this coast had heard in days. And the dead turned toward it. Not all at once, like grass turning in a change of wind. The heads came round, the drifting bodies swung, the whole slow closing hand of them paused, caught between the small quiet walking thing they had almost surrounded and the vast bronze voice on the water, and the bell rang on, peal after peal, the way it did every morning, and the dead of the drowned coast began to drift toward the sound the way the dead always drift toward sound, and the road before Merritt opened. Not wide, not parted like the sea in the old stories, just opened. A seam through the crowd of them, a walking space, a path the width of a procession, straight down the old pilgrim road toward the gates. Merritt walked it. She walked it with the dead shifting past her on either side close enough to touch. Their ruined faces turned away toward the bell, and she did not run even now, because some deep still part of her understood that the seam was made of sound and her running feet could tear it. And she walked the last miles of the pilgrim road through the middle of the drowned dead at a pilgrim's pace with her husband's son held out before her in both hands like a candle. and the bell of Ardenveil rang and rang and rang, and did not stop until she was under the walls. The gate ward who found her, a woman collapsed against the pilgrim's postern with a tin sun gripped in a bleeding hand, swore the morning office had run long that day, though no one could say why, and the bell captain, when they asked him, checked his ropes and his novices and could find no reason for it, and said in the end, with a shrug that the church would repeat for years. The bell rang until it was done ringing. Ask it. They took her in the way Ardenveil takes in every pilgrim, which is entirely, and it was 2 days before she could stand without shaking, and a week before the candle priests stopped hovering, and on the morning she could walk the length of the sanctum unaided. She did the thing she had crossed the world's most dangerous miles to do. The sanctum of the first light was full of light. That was the whole art of the place. The windows built to catch the sun off the water, so the great hall stood in gold from dawn to dusk, and pilgrims from every port in the surviving world knelt in it shoulder to shoulder, each with their own small business with the divine, and nobody stared at one more weathered woman with healing feet, because everyone in that hall had paid something to be there. Merit knelt in the gold light and took out the tin sun, and said what she had come to say. Toma, candlemaker of Nairi, husband. He meant to come his whole life and I came for him. He's here now, whatever of him I could carry, it's here. She laid the little sun on the offering rail with all the others, hundreds of them, tin and silver and carved bone, every one of them somebody's whole story, and she found the letting go of it easier than she had feared because the promise was not the metal. The metal had just kept her hand warm while she carried it. And one more, she said, the one who read, he's on your road by the waymark a day short of the funnel with his book. He walked to you on purpose, which is more than I did. Say his name to yourself since I don't have it. The light saw him reading, I know it did. A candle priest found her afterward, on the sanctum steps in the sun, a young one, Ernest, the kind who collected pilgrim stories for the archive, and asked her, gently, the question they had all been circling since the gate ward carried her in. They're saying the road was full, the priest said. The overland way. They're saying you walked through the dead of the whole coast, alone, and the bell, he hesitated, wanting it and not wanting it, the way people want a miracle. Was it a miracle? Did the first light part the dead for you? I have to write something in the book. Tell me what to write. Merit thought about it for a long time, sitting in the sun, and she gave him the only answer she had, which was the true one, and which she would give, word for word, to everyone who ever asked for the rest of her life. This, she said, I walked 5 days and I did every hour of it myself, my feet, my hiding, my mistakes, my getting up again. Nobody carried me one step, and if you write that anybody did, you're stealing from a candle maker and I'll know. And then write, on the last morning when there was nothing left of me but the promise, I chose to walk instead of die waiting, and a bell rang that rings every morning, and it rang longer than it ever rings, and the road opened, and no one can tell me why. But which was it, the priest said, your feet or the light? What do I write in the book? Which one saved you? And Merit smiled, because 5 days on the pilgrim road had answered that question in the only way it ever gets answered. Yes, she said. And she sat on the steps of the sanctum in the morning gold, sole survivor of the gull of morning, the woman who walked to Ardenveil and watched the light come up over the water the way it had come up every single morning of the drowned world's 200 years, the sun rising through the storm clouds, exactly like a little tin token she used to carry, and found she did not need to know which one it had been. The walk was hers. The bell was the bell's. The promise was kept either way. That was the whole of what she'd learned on the road, and it was enough to live on. You do every step yourself, all of them, every one, and then, sometimes, at the very end of what you have, the morning rings anyway.